All right, a place for cultural engagement. As I wrestled through this question and what to share this week, three of my favorite sort of heroes of cultural engagement kept coming back to mind. Francis Schaeffer, any Schaeffer fans out there? All right. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, any Solzhenitsyn fans? Any Kuyperians out there? Abraham Kuyper? All right, I have legal authority as a Biola professor to grant you extra credit for liking Kuyper. 40 years ago, it was 40 years ago that Schaeffer released his famous Christian manifesto. It was a believer's response to the Communist Manifesto and the Humanist Manifesto, and he opens it with this line. He says, the basic problem of the Christians in this country, speaking of America, in the last 80 years or so, in regard to society and in regard to government, is that they have seen things in bits and pieces instead of totals. So Schaeffer goes on to talk about how Christians in the 60s and 70s and 80s were wringing their hands over sexual perversion, the secular indoctrination happening in public education, the assault on family life, the trampled rights of the unborn. But, Schaeffer says, and I quote, they have not seen this as a totality, each thing being a part, a symptom of a much larger problem. It was 3 years before that that the great Russian novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn delivered his famous 1978 Harvard commencement speech, A World Split Apart. He makes a similar point. He argues that addressing society's problems at the surface level of legal and political categories, rather than at root moral and spiritual categories, in Solzhenitsyn's words, quote, prevents one from seeing the size and meaning of events, and, quote, makes space for the absolute triumph of absolute evil in the world. It was 80 years before Solzhenitsyn's famous Harvard speech that Abraham Kuyper delivered the Stone Lectures, also known as Lectures on Calvinism. And in his opening lines of Lectures on Calvinism, Kuyper makes this observation. He says, what we're dealing with is two life systems wrestling with one another in mortal combat. And the combatants, according to Kuyper, were modernists on the one hand, that he describes as seeking to build a world of their own from the data of the natural man and to construct man himself, striving to vanquish with violent intensity those who reverently bow the knee to Christ. So it was this struggle between the modernist and the anti-Christian and the Bible-believing Christian that Kuyper saw as, quote, the struggle in Europe and the struggle in America. So what I want to talk about as we think about cultural engagement is how to move beyond a bits and pieces approach that Schaeffer criticized, the myopic legalism that Solzhenitsyn rejected, and the failure to reckon with the epic worldview showdown happening before our very eyes that Kuyper saw raging behind the headlines 100 years ago. To beckon us to behold a bigger picture, to see through the issues, the headline issues that fill up our news feeds on a daily basis, to the issues behind the issues. And we are aware that one of the issues behind the issues is worldview, right? How you answer the perennial questions, metaphysics, what's real, epistemology, how do you know what's real, ethics, how do we live in light of what we know about what's real. You guys have heard the worldview analysis before. I'm fully behind it, but I want to take it a level deeper. And here's my running thesis for our time today. There is no understanding and engaging culture without seriously reckoning with humanity's irrepressible religiosity. There is no understanding and engaging culture today without seriously reckoning with humanity's irrepressible religiosity. You guys know Paul's argument in Romans 1. He doesn't frame the conversation as, well, you have the theists on the one hand, the God believers, versus the atheistic secularists on the other hand, and those two are in an epic worldview showdown. No, for Paul, it's not a question of to worship or not to worship. For Paul, everyone worships. For Paul, everyone is on their knees to someone or something. Before I came to teach at Biola University, I taught at a secular college in Southern California for 10 years. I had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of quote-unquote atheists come through my classrooms. And I can tell you from experience, I never met a true to the core atheist. They were all on their knees to someone or something. It might have been a political ideology that they staked their ultimate identity and mission in life in. It might have been a romantic partner that became their integration point for their personality. It might have been science. It might have been fill in the blank. But this is Paul's argument in Romans 1, that it's not a question of the worshipers versus the non-worshipers. Rather, it's a showdown between creator worshipers and creation worshipers, right? We are all irrepressibly religious. If we hopped in a time machine together, if we got our flux capacitors fluxing and went 88 miles an hour and generated 1.21 gigawatts and fired ourselves off through history and landed in 1792, and we took a trip to Paris. Anybody want to go to Paris? That sound fun? Yeah, I'm in. We would find a 14-year-old girl named Mademoiselle Candet, who is a young actress, and she was hired to play the goddess of reason. They dressed her up as the goddess of reason, and the Parisians hoisted her up on their shoulders, marched along Parvis de Notre Dame, leading right into Notre Dame Cathedral. They installed her at the high point, and decked out in their Sunday best, they stood and sang hymns to the goddess of reason. That had to be awkward for a 14-year-old Mademoiselle Candet. But you see the point. It's not that the French revolutionaries, it's not that the French Enlightenment was saying, we're done with religion, we're going to bow down to reason. They bowed down to reason. Reason didn't replace religion, reason became a religion. We can talk about the Soviet Union under Stalin. Under Stalin's leadership, you had something known as the League of Militant Atheists that was formed, that was charged with bulldozing synagogues and churches. And you would think if ever there was an atheist regime, a totalitarian atheist regime, surely we could find it in the Soviet Union or maybe in Mao's China. But in both, mankind's irrepressible religiosity was still manifest. So now, man's worship drives and appetites just got redirected to Lord Stalin or Lord Mao. Right? This is Paul's argument in Romans 1. If we don't worship the Creator, we will bow down and worship the creation. We're all familiar with Calvin's famous line, right? That the human heart is an idol factory. Dostoevsky put it well when he said, man has no more constant and agonizing anxiety than to find as quickly as possible someone to worship. The economist Bob Goudsward argues that everyone, quote, absolutizes something. We all serve gods. We take on the image of our gods, and then we build society or cultures that is in our God's images. This is an insight, Paul's insight from Romans 1. Scholarship today is slowly catching up. You could take the feminist author and social critic and atheist Professor Camille Paglia. Paglia says, and I quote, human beings need religion. They need a religious perspective, a cosmic perspective, says Paglia. And getting rid of the orthodox religions because they were too conservative has simply led to a new religion, she says. And she identifies this new religion, in her words, she calls it political correctness. She labels it a form of fanaticism, citing her own experience with second-wave feminists, whom she likens to a Spanish Inquisition seeking to destroy her for committing heresy. Cultural commentator Andrew Sullivan makes a similar observation when he says, once esoteric neo-Marxist ideologies, critical race theory, gender theory, postmodernism, the bastard children of Herbert Marcuse and Michel Foucault have become the premises of higher education. Listen to this: the orthodoxy of a new and mandatory religion. The anthropologist Paul Hibert echoes. He says, a new Western religion emerged to offer us meaning based on self-realization, not forgiveness of personal sins and reconciliation with God and others. Rather, the self has become God, and self-fulfillment has become our salvation. In short, we would do well to wake up to this reality that all the most combustible, explosive questions of our culture in the 21st century are fundamentally, at their bedrock level, worship questions. They're contemporary expressions of humanity's irrepressible religiosity. And to ignore that Romans 1 insight, that Pauline insight, is to limit ourselves to a bits and pieces approach that Schaeffer criticized. The missing the size and meaning of events, as Solzhenitsyn criticized, and making ourselves oblivious to what Kuyper called the struggle in the West. So you see this with one of my literary heroes. Any David Foster Wallace fans in the house? All right, we got one. Yes, extra credit. Wallace, in his famous commencement speech, "This is Water," he makes it blunt. He says, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there's actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships, says Wallace. The only choice we get is what to worship. It was Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famous transcendentalist poet. A person will worship something, says Emerson. Have no doubt about that. We may think that our tribute is paid in secret, in the dark recesses of our hearts, but it will come out. And so, again, this is the Pauline insight. It's not a question between the atheist and the theist. It's a question between the creator and the creation worshipers. And so as we ponder cultural engagement in 2022, it's helpful if we identify, well, what are the particular besetting idols of our age and on our campuses? And I want to build a case for you that, we could talk about sex or glamour or physique or politics. We can talk about a whole slew of idols, but I want to argue that there's one sort of meta-idol that has captivated the imaginations of the world. I would argue it has become the world's fastest growing world religion, and I refer to the idol of self. The idol of self. So I want to walk you through. We're going to talk about how the idol of self, if we really want to understand and meaningfully engage the culture, you will see self-worship as precisely that, a religion. It has adherents. It has patron saints and prophets. It has its own hymnal. It has its own liturgies. It has its own commandments. It has its own underlying theology. So adherents. What are the adherents of the idol of self? Well, according to recent Barna research, 84% of Americans believe that enjoying yourself is the highest goal of life. 84% of Americans. That's pretty mind-blowing. So in a room of theologians, help me out here. What is the chief end of man? And the Catechism answers the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Our culture has flipped that to say the chief end of man is to glorify and enjoy your three best friends, me, myself, and I, forever. 84% of Americans. 86% of Americans believe that in order to enjoy yourself, you must, quote, pursue the things that you desire most. And a full 91%, 9 out of 10 Americans affirm the statement, to find yourself, look within yourself. To find yourself, look within yourself. I don't know if anybody's ever tried that before, but the answers are not within. That's where the problems are, amen? So we have adherents in the cult of self. We also have prophets and saints in the cult of self. Famously, Nero turned his self-worship into the enforced faith of the empire with the imperial cult. Fred Nietzsche inspired entire generations and even countries to become the Übermensch, supermen who transcend traditional morality and achieve godlike status as their own sovereign makers of reality. Saint Nietzsche's all-star acolyte, the wildly influential academic Michel Foucault, took to self-glorification, if you read his writings, particularly on sexuality, that sadomasochistic sexual exploration was the means to achieve this Dionysian ideal and this self-deity and this Superman status, as Marquis de Sade had a few centuries before Foucault. The Lizard King himself, Jim Morrison of Doors fame, used his baritone crooning and unhinged stage antics to add a layer of sort of rock and roll romanticism to Nietzsche and de Sade's dogmas of uninhibited self-assertion. We could talk about Harvard professor and hippie guru Timothy Leary. He advocated psychedelics as a means of self-worship, self-elevation, self-enlightenment, self-exaltation, to the point where he believed that if you could just contaminate America's water supply with LSD, we would usher in the age of Aquarius. We could talk about L. Ron Hubbard, the writer of Dianetics, the founder of Scientology. It's all about finding your inner thetan, the God within, right? He was a sci-fi author in the 50s and 60s, writing sci-fi novels for pennies to the word. And he actually told Time magazine in an interview in 1968, why write science fiction novels for pennies to the word when I can turn those novels into a religion and become a multimillionaire? He went on record saying that to Time magazine in the late 60s. So what does he do? He puts a sci-fi spin on the running theme of self-worship. We could talk about the provocateur and father of modern-day Satanism, Aleister Crowley. He summed up his entire worldview and ethic with the phrase, "To thine own self be true." We could talk about French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, beat novelist Jack Kerouac, tech giant Steve Jobs, who said, "I see no reason not to always follow your heart." We could talk about assorted pop divas to join our ensemble of saints. So what I'm talking about, again, self-worship, if we want to be conversant with the culture, we need to understand that, number one, it has adherents, 82, 84, 91%. It has its own saints and prophets. And I would add that, let me hammer down this point for a second, and let's draw the whole conversation back to Scripture. As we list the sort of the patron saints and prophets of self-worship, towards the top of the list, I would put the first Adam. The first Adam as a patron saint of self-worship. Let me unpack that for you exegetically from Genesis 3:5, just briefly. You guys are familiar with the scene. God has just spoken the universe into being. He's declared his benedictions over his creation. It's good, it's good, it's good, it's good. And by Genesis 3, the serpent says the following phrase in verse 5. If you eat the fruit, you will be, quote, like God, knowing good and evil. Like God, knowing good and evil. Now, for years and years, that phrase baffled me. And I read the commentators, and nobody seemed to really hit it on the head. That the interpretations were something like, well, God has experience of good and evil in a way Adam and Eve didn't pre-fall, and so they would gain an experiential knowledge of evil by eating the fruit. And that just didn't quite resonate, because God doesn't experience evil in the sense of committing or actualizing it. There was just a lot of holes in the traditional interpretations. And a light bulb moment happened for me when I read Abraham Kuyper's Common Grace, Volume 1. And he does some interesting things with this text that I think are more faithful to the original Hebrew. He argues that that phrase knowing, like God knowing, there's not really a great English equivalent to the Hebrew word bakar in that passage. It's not just I know intellectually because I've studied it. It's not just I know experientially because I've done it. It's something like a maker's knowledge. I know it because I made it that way. Let me illustrate this way. So after I graduated from Biola University back in 1967, just kidding, I'm not that old. I went on to live with a slew of old high school friends. One of those friends plays bass for a band by the name of Lincoln Park. And Dave is his name. I had known him since high school. And at the time, I was working at a place called the Christian Research Institute. I'd come home from work. He'd come home from the studio, and I would listen to the tracks that the band had laid down that day for what would later become the Meteora album. And I would grill him. I would ask him questions. What effect are you using on the bass guitar here? Whose idea was that key change? What's the time signature? It didn't matter. I never once stumped Dave because he knew the songs. He didn't know them because he had studied them or listened to them or looked at the sheet music. He knew them because he made them. He sovereignly decided to use that effect on the bass, to have that key change, to have that tempo. He had a maker's knowledge. Something like that is what's going on with this Hebrew word. God doesn't have an abstract intellectual or experiential knowledge so much as the emphasis of the text is he has a maker's knowledge. He knows reality because he sovereignly defined it to be the way it is. Now, the next part of that phrase, so you will be, the serpent tempts Adam and Eve. You'll be like God knowing, the knowing maker. You'll be sovereign over. You'll be supreme over. You'll be the definer of. Next phrase, good and evil. Now, for years, I just read that. We tend to read that as just moral categories. Good, evil, right, wrong, just, unjust. And then reading through some of the old rabbinic literature on this, I had another light bulb moment. If we hopped back in that time machine, if we went back to the BCs and hung out with Jewish rabbis, it would be commonplace for them to use polar opposites to describe everything in between. This was common in ancient Jewish lingo. So you might say black and white, and an ancient Jew would understand you're referring to every color. You might say the Beatles and Nickelback, and it would be understood you're referring to every band in history, right? The best and the worst. No offense to the Nickelback fans. So good and evil is ancient Hebrew shorthand for everything. What's the serpent's temptation? Hey, Adam and Eve, you can be like God, being the knowing makers, the definers, supreme over, sovereign over, the meaning makers of everything. That's the original temptation. Self-worship. To labor under the delusion of our own sovereignty. And so my point here is that while the cult of self-worship in our day pretends to be, markets itself as cutting edge, innovative, on, quote, the right side of history, progressive, forward-looking, I just made a case for you that it is hyper traditional, hyper conventional. It's nothing new. It goes back to Genesis 3. Self-worship is hardly innovative. It goes back to literally what is humanity's oldest lie. It's hardly as sexy and cutting edge as it markets itself to be. So the cult of self has adherents. It has its saints and prophets going all the way back to the first Adam. It takes its marching orders from an ancient snake. It also has hymns. The cult of self has adherents, prophets, saints, and hymns. So you see, old Blue Eyes himself, Frank Sinatra, right? One of his most famous songs, I Did It My Way. Roxette closes its 80s pop rock hit with the looping mantra, listen to your heart, sung 13 times consecutively. Southern rockers Leonard Skinner in their famous song, Simple Man, follow your heart and nothing else. Country music icon Reba McEntire assures us that the heart won't lie. I think Jeremiah might have something to say about that in the 17th chapter. I think Ecclesiastes might have something to say about that when he says the human heart is full of moral insanity. But according to Reba McEntire, the heart won't lie. Proto-punk rockers, the Kinks, sing, truly, truly trust your heart. The original bad boys of hard rock, Motorhead, sing over gritty power chords, listen to your heart, listen all your life, listen to your heart, then you'll be all right. Then we have children's songs. There's a children's liturgy here. In Disney's Mulan, there's a song by Stevie Wonder as he's flanked by the boy band 98 Degrees, and they catechize young, impressionable minds with these lyrics. Don't think so much. Let your heart decide. True to your heart, you must be true to your heart. That's when the heavens will part. Your heart can tell you no lies. Your heart knows what's good for you. Let your heart show you the way. Then there's Thumbelina, also targeted at children, where Giacomo, an animated swallow, sings to Thumbelina, when you follow your heart, if you have to journey far, here's a little trick. You don't need a guiding star. Trust your ticker. You'll get there quicker. This gospel of follow your heart is ubiquitous. Then you have enough tween-targeted pop songs, and I know this as a father of four, there's enough pop songs targeted at tweens that could easily form a year-long playlist. Songs about bucking authority, songs about your wildest dreams all coming true, songs about being a supergirl or some wild, roaring animal goddess who eats people's expectations and excretes fireworks and rainbows. Packed auditoriums of adolescents, hands outstretched in worship pose, sing in unison with Jojo Siwa. My heart's on a mission, not just gonna listen. Whoa, I'm doing my own thing, and it's a real good feeling. My life, my rules, my dreams, it's real. I feel everything. My life, I choose who to be, so I'ma be me. No, nobody can change me, Jojo Siwa sings. Nobody can change me. I follow my own lead. Once you get to know me, you'll see, got all these emotions, and they're guiding every moment. This is the cultural moment we find ourselves in. We need to engage the trendy idols of the day, and again, in our day, with its hymnal, with its prophets and saints, with its liturgies, with its adherents. That is the cult of self. It also comes with its own set of commandments. Like any religion, self-worship comes with its commandments. Let me just walk you through quickly the new Decalogue. The new 10 commandments of self-worship. Commandment number 1, thou shalt always act in accord with your chief end to glorify and enjoy yourself forever. Hashtag, live your best life. Commandment number 2, thou shalt not be outdated, but always on the edge of the new. Hashtag, okay, boomer. Thou shalt be courageous enough to jettison other people's expectations. Hashtag, be true to yourself. Commandment number 4, thou shalt obey your emotions at all cost. Hashtag, follow your heart. Commandment number 5, thou shalt pursue the rush of boundary-free experience. Hashtag, YOLO. You only live once. Commandment number 6 of the cult of self-worship, thou shalt invent and advertise your own identity. Hashtag, authentic. Commandment number 7, you should trust yourself as the ultimate source of truth. Never let anyone oppress you with the outdated notion of being a sinner who needs grace. Hashtag, the answers are within. Commandment number 8, thou shalt force the external world, the universe, to bend around your desires and your subjective feelings. Hashtag, live the dream. Commandment number 9, thou shalt be radically accepting of all lifestyles and all love lives as equally valid. Love is love. And finally, commandment number 10 of the cult of self-worship, thou shalt be an activist, liberating others from social oppression. How is social oppression defined? Any power that seeks to hold people back from following their hearts and being their authentic selves. #woke. There you have not just adherents, not just saints and prophets, not just a thick hymnal. You have the 10 commandments that our culture abides by in 2022. You also have liturgies, daily rituals that move these doctrines of self-worship from our heads down into our hearts and into our hands. We could talk about the ritual of filtered social media image crafting is one of the liturgies, where I am inventing and now advertising myself with filtered social media images. And then you have another liturgy is filterless stream of consciousness public journaling, where my thoughts, my opinion, my hot take, the whole world definitely needs to hear that all the time, right? They're entitled to my opinion. And any new headline, whether it's economics, whether it's based on race, you can always expect everybody's going to be an overnight expert on whatever the latest headline is, and that they need to broadcast their opinions around the world. Streaming service binging can be another liturgy where it's all about if I can scroll through and find what fits my subjective state of mind in the moment. The on-demand self-gratification of pornography is another powerful liturgy of self-worship. And we could just add shopping to the list. Shopping in a consumer context can become its own liturgy of self-worship. You see this insight from a sociologist named Thomas Luckman. He saw this rising trend back in the 60s. He said, the individual is left to his own devices in choosing goods and services, friends, marriage partners, neighbors, hobbies, and even, Luckman says, ultimate meanings in a relatively autonomous fashion. The consumer orientation, in short, is not limited to economic products, but characterizes the relation of the individual to the entire culture and to the self. So we have adherents, we have saints and prophets, we have hymns, we have commands, we have liturgies. In self-worship, you also have an underlying theology. So think about, in a biblical worldview, our Decalogue doesn't pop into existence out of a vacuum or out of thin air. Those commandments are not arbitrary. The Euthyphro dilemma misses the tertian quid. These commands are not above God, and they are not arbitrarily instantiated by God. Rather, they are an expression of a deep theology about who God is. We should tell the truth because God is a God of truth, right? We should be faithful because God is a faithful God. We should rest because God is sovereign and He can keep the universe running when we rest and Sabbath. These commands flow from a deep underlying theology. The same holds true for those commands of self-worship. There's a deep underlying theological substructure that we need to be aware of if we're going to meaningfully engage the cultural moment. You see this is something that people already understand beyond the bounds of the church. Chris Hinkle out of Harvard says that homosexuality must make its moral case, not merely its civil or social rights case. It must show, listen to this language, the deep spirituality of homosexual love. In A Parent's Guide on Sexuality from Nicolosi, we read, I think the future of the world, the hope of the world depends on us. That men who love men are the only people who can, listen to the soteriological language, the only people who can save this planet. That is our purpose. Do you hear the theological, the spiritual, the religious undertones here? In the book Lesbians, Gay Men, and the Law, Paula Edelbrook writes, being queer is more than setting up house and sleeping with a person of the same gender and seeking state approval in doing so. Rather, being queer means pushing the parameters of sex, sexuality, and family, and in the process, listen to this, it's almost like a pagan postmillennialism, in the process transforming the very fabric of society. So they understand that what they're doing here is soteriological and spiritual. And so I just briefly, I'm a systematic theologian by training. I want to walk you through the systematic theology of self-worship at a very brisk pace here. So it's theology proper. The theology proper goes something like this. In historic Christianity, you have the creator-creature distinction. And one of the many distinctions between God and us, between the creator and the creature, is that he has a unique and authoritative role in defining the human telos, the purpose, the reason, the design, why we're here. So God not only determines that humans exist, but why we exist. The built-in meaning of human nature, what we exist for, our telos, traces its origin to a transcendent creator. So, in other words, human nature is not like a bowl of alphabet soup with jumbled up letters that you can arrange to make any message you want. Human nature is more like a book, in that we are authored beings with meaning and purpose. Now, here's the key, is that authoring a human identity is a God-sized task. This needs to be part of our message to a culture buckling under the weight of self-definition. I see it in the classroom. I see it with my students. I see it in millennials. I see it in Gen Z. All of these singing, dancing swallows telling them to follow their tickers. All of the Stevie Wonder Mulan soundtracks telling them to just follow their hearts and define themselves. I would argue that that is just cruel. It is just cruel, especially to fill little minds up with that kind of propaganda. Why? Because creating and sustaining an identity over time is a God-sized task. When you hoist the weight of self-definition on the shoulders of a little kid, or any human for that matter, it's only a matter of time before they buckle under that impossible weight. I have 4 kids. My 11-year-old Holland, we call her Dutchie for short. I've been playing a game I picked up from Oz Guinness years ago, Spot the Lie. Spot the Lie, you're watching the latest Disney movie, listening to a soundtrack, watching a YouTube clip. If the kids can spot a lie, a falsehood, explain why it's false, why it's unbiblical, they get $1. And I got to tell you, they're getting so good at it, part of me thinks I'm going to be sleeping in a cardboard box here in the next month or so. They're getting very, very good at it. Well, this is going back over a year ago. And so Dutchie, our 11-year-old, she was 10 at the time, she comes cheerfully bounding down the stairs and says, Daddy, Daddy, you owe me another $1. I said, all right, what do you got, Dutch? She says, I was watching a commercial. It was for some new fairy, pixie, unicorn, princess, whatever. And she said, Daddy, the commercial told me that I should follow my heart. I said, okay, continue. Where's the lie? Spot the lie. This was her exact response, verbatim. I memorized it. It is tattooed in my brain. It is filed away in my mind under Ultimate Parenting Wins in that file cabinet. She said, and I quote, Daddy, I don't want to follow my own heart. My heart is fallen. I'd rather follow God's heart. Cue the proud daddy tears. I'm like, oh, come here. I love you so much. So let's just say she got $5 for spotting that lie. But you see how radically countercultural that is. I don't want to follow my heart, Daddy. My heart's fallen. I want to follow God's heart. You see, a lot of the language that's used to market the cult of self is couched in terms of authenticity. If you guys have read Charles Taylor, he's done a lot of work on, we've been through an age of science, an age of reason, an age of faith. Well, what are we in now? Robbie George out of Princeton would say we're in the age of feeling. I think he's right about that. For Charles Taylor, he would say we're in the age of authenticity. He writes about it in the secular age. By authenticity, he means there is this new mandate, this new imperative to be true to yourself, to follow your heart, to be your authentic self. As I summed up in those commandments, never let anybody question your feelings, your identity, your emotions, because that's oppression. But let's think this through together. Is authenticity the right word for it? If I'm approaching the world from a posture that says, my feelings are sacred, my feelings are sacrosanct, my feelings are unquestionable, my feelings are authoritative and binding, that is not authentic, friends. That is arrogance. That is just flat out old-fashioned arrogance. I refuse to question my feelings or let anybody else question my feelings. Don't you hear that arrogance in those lyrics I read from Jojo Siwa? Nobody can change me. Nobody. I'll follow my own lead. It's arrogance. And I would add that this cult of self-worship, because of its theology proper, maybe here's some helpful categories to set the theology proper of self-worship in. So we have the doctrine of divine simplicity. And there's a lot of raging debates about that right now, but just as kind of a minimal starting point with that. It's the idea that God, as a unified being, you can't chop him up. He's not a composite being. It's not that you add love plus justice, plus mercy, plus compassion, plus omniscience. You add up these distinctive qualities and it equals God. Rather, God is fully integrated. He's one. He's unified. He's simple. It follows from that I don't have the option, if I'm going to be a creator instead of a creation worshiper, I don't have a live option to say, I really like the sovereignty of God, but the justice of God, the wrath of God, I'll pass. I can't deny a revealed attribute of God without denying the whole God who's actually revealed himself. That's one logical consequence of the doctrine of divine simplicity. You can't approach God doing Subway theology. You walk into Subway, hey, I'll take some mayo, I'll pass on the mustard, I'll take some pepperoncinis, I'll pass on the olives. I get to custom craft my sandwich according to my own desires and preferences. We can't do Subway theology, right? God is fully who he is in a way that as we learn more about him, we bow the knee, accept, and worship that. Now, follow me here. Notice the language surrounding a lot of the transgender debates in our culture, a lot of the LGBTQ plus, sort of the alphabet soup debates in our culture. And a lot of the language is, if you misgender me, if you refuse to abide by my preferred pronoun, it's not merely you have offended me. It's not merely you have hurt my feelings. The language, if you're paying attention, is much stronger. It's you are erasing my existence. You're seeking to cancel my very existence. Do you see how we have taken divine simplicity and erased the creator-creature distinction, assigned it to our own fallenness, so that if anybody denies any aspect of how we feel about ourselves, they're heretics, right? So these divine attributes, one by one, get applied to the fallen creature instead of the holy creator. You see this in the words of RuPaul. Christianity has St. Paul. The cult of self-worship has its own St. Paul, the drag queen RuPaul, who says in an interview with Time magazine recently, quote, "Drag has always served a purpose. We mock identity. We're shapeshifters. We are God in drag, and it's our role to remind people of that." So under this doctrinal tenet of autonomous I, the self-creating self, the self takes the sovereign mantle of man-making that God has held in traditional Christian theology. And again, part of my critique here is that's just an impossible weight to bear, and people buckle under that weight. Let's continue through the systematic theology here of self-worship. So this is the words of Colin Campbell, a culture commentator, and I think he says it better than I could. Describing this theology proper of self-worship, he says, "The self becomes, in effect, a very personal God or spirit to whom one owes obedience. Hence, experiencing with all of its connotations of gratificatory and stimulative feelings becomes an ethical activity, an aspect of duty. This is a radically different doctrine of the person." So there's anthropology at stake here. The person is no longer conceived of as a character constructed painfully out of the unpromising raw materials of original sin, but rather the self liberated through experiences and strong feelings from the inhibiting constraints of social convention. So again, now the self becomes deified, and that is an impossible weight. Let me say it more simply. It's not a coincidence that since the rise of self-worship in the 1960s, that's when a lot of these sea changes are happening in the broader culture. From 1960 to the turn of the 21st century, America has doubled its divorce rate, tripled its teen suicide rate, quadrupled its violent crime rate, quintupled its prison population, sextupled out-of-wedlock births, and septupled the rate of cohabitation without marriage, which is a significant predictor of divorce. You see my point? There's something just so freeing and liberating and joyful about letting the Creator be the Creator and living the authored life rather than the self-authored life. And that needs to be part of our message to this generation, is Jesus' invitation. Look, you're heavy, you're burdened. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened. I will give you rest. I will give you rest from the impossible weight of creating and sustaining your own identity. Now, what happens is the me, the individual, is too finite to bear the weight of a constructed identity. And so they need to invoke the power of the we to sustain the finite me. And so now all this begins to get political. And so you can see this in the hamartiology and soteriology of self-worship that goes something like this. In a Christian view, we find the doctrine of justification. Justification refers to, among other things, the divine act whereby God declares the sinner not guilty on the basis of the redemptive death and bodily resurrection of Jesus. So in a biblical picture, God is the judge, Satan is the accuser, sort of the prosecuting attorney. Jesus is our defense attorney, a parakletos in 1 John 2. And he appeals to his own completed death sentence to plead our justification. So that word parakletos, 1 John 2. Para, beside, kletos, elbow. It's this first century term for a defense attorney who, you're guilty, your defense attorney comes para, your kletos, next to you at the elbow, argues for your not guilty sentence. That's one of Jesus' ongoing ministries for us. Isn't that good news? You don't have to plead your own case for your own innocence, for your own justification. You have on permanent retainer the greatest defense attorney in the history of the cosmos. And he never loses a case because he always has the knockdown, drag-out argument of his own shed blood. Amen? And so that's the actual gospel. But if we leave God out of the process, our need for catharsis, our need to feel not guilty doesn't magically disappear. It's just going to get redirected. And so the need for justification isn't unique to Christians. It's a universal phenomenon. So whether we're talking about the Hindu plunging into the flowing waters of the Ganges, whether we're talking about the Muslim bowing 5 days, practicing their salat towards Mecca, whether we're talking about the Jew at the Wailing Wall, whether we're talking about the atheist virtue signaling on social media, the Roman Catholic in the confessional booth, we're all seeking justification. We're all seeking the not guilty sentence. And if we leave God out of the equation, then we turn often to the next biggest entity that we can imagine. We turn to society. We turn to culture. We turn to government, media, law, education, entertainment. Now we need to get everyone to declare us in unison not guilty. We must then demonize and silence anyone who fails to acknowledge and celebrate our guiltlessness. So the little sisters of the poor, right? The baker, the photographer, the Christian university become the collective functional equivalent of Lucifer in a traditional Christian picture of salvation. You tracking? So now who is the accuser saying, you know what, there's sin there that needs to be taken to the cross? The accuser becomes the church or anybody upholding traditional gender distinctions as something beautiful and not something arbitrary to be erased. Elizabeth Nolan Brown cites a whole slew of psychologists on this point. And she says this. She says, the kind of moral outrage that we typically classify as altruistic is often a function of self-interest, wielded to assuage feelings of personal culpability for societal harms or to reinforce to ourselves and others, listen to this, our own status as a very good person. What we often take as altruistic, I'm defending the poor, I'm speaking up for the marginalized, is oftentimes, on a deeper level, part of a soul-deep quest to establish ourselves as a, quote, very good person. It's a quest for justification. So we then constantly impute guilt to others to feel justified ourselves. They are the fascists. They are the phobics. They are the bigots. This offers a subjective sense of something like justification gives us, but yet infinitely far from the true justification offered in Christ. As I wind down here, let me talk about the eschatology of our culture of self-worship. Sin, on this view, is no longer an internal category. How, after all, could a telos-defining, impassible deity like the self possibly violate a higher moral law if the self is the highest? Sin must now be relocated from the self to the institutions. This is Rousseau 2.0. This is the French Revolution 2.0. The oppressors, according to the categories of neo-Marxism. The great and final triumph over evil then becomes a triumph over any institution or oppressor who dares to question the self-defined self. And so what emerges from this theology of self-worship is what I described earlier. It's a kind of secular or pagan postmillennialism in which intersectional alliances of self-defined selves must mobilize for the great eschatological struggle. Cultural, political, legal efforts become a spiritualized quest to usher in the new heavens and the new earth. And this quest is every bit as eschatological and utopian as it was for the French revolutionaries of the 18th century or the 20th century Marxists and communists. But we must say with tears, this new revolution, because it renounces the creator-creature distinction, because it overestimates our own goodness and radically underestimates our propensity for evil and depravity, this new revolution will prove every bit as dystopian. So let me wrap up like this. To finish where we started, my thesis again, there's no understanding and engaging the culture without recognizing and naming and reckoning with the gods of our age. In our age, the cult of self, a cult of self-worship, the cult with, as we've seen, adherents, the cult with saints and prophets, with hymns, with commandments, with liturgies, with an underlying theology. This religion pretends it's not a religion, it is. It pretends to be new and cutting edge. It's really hyper conventional, advancing what is literally humanity's only, or oldest, I should say, lie, taking its marching orders from an ancient lying snake. It pretends to be authentic. It's really arrogance. It pretends the answers are within. In reality, the problems are within. It pretends to be adventurous. In reality, it's impossibly dull. We end up in what David Foster Wallace called our skull-sized kingdoms. Nothing beyond that, which gets incredibly boring really quick. It pretends to create supermen who soar above convention, who march against the herd. In reality, self-worship is to join the herd. It's to moo along with the cows of our age. It pretends to be about acceptance. It's profoundly intolerant. It pretends to make you happy, but it deprives you of awe and therefore true joy. Let me camp on this point for 60 seconds. Many of you have read Robert Jastro's God and the Astronomers, where he's sort of cataloging the advances in Big Bang cosmology over the last 100 years. And he's got one of the greatest zingers on the final page. He says, it's like for centuries, scientists have been climbing the mountain of knowledge, the summit, and they finally, in the 20th century, with the redshift and the Hubble telescope discovering the expanding universe, finally with Big Bang cosmology. It was like we pulled ourselves over that top rock where the scientists were warmly greeted by a camp of theologians who had been waiting for them for centuries. And the book ends. You just got to love that. Well, something similar is happening where the science is gradually catching up to what Scripture has been saying and what theologians have been saying for millennia. We are created for, in the Old Testament, yira, the fear of the Lord, for reverence, for awe, to be awestruck. Paul Piff, he's a researcher out of UCI down by where I live in Southern California. He's done a lot of research where he will expose subjects to elicitors of awe. And what he found was that if you take somebody and you just show them sweeping panoramas of maybe the Grand Canyon, maybe the Aurora Borealis, the Northern Lights, if you expose people to elicitors of awe, he found that people become more pro-social, less selfish. They actually take better care of the environment. There's a whole litany of positive effects once the mind and heart are in a state of being awestruck. Michelle Chioda is a researcher out of Arizona State, and she asked questions like, why do 50,000 people a year make the highly inconvenient trek to Mount Everest? Why do over 1 million people venture to Niagara Falls or to the Grand Canyon when such experiences don't give you any financial benefit? They aren't particularly entertaining. And her conclusion is that as a species, we crave awe. And so Michelle Chioda, did some fascinating studies where, like Paul Piff, subjecting people to elicitors of awe not only made them more pro-social, less narcissistic, but she found, this is fascinating research, that people were less easily duped by fallacious arguments when in a state of awe. They reasoned more clearly, they spotted bad arguments and could build good arguments when their hearts were in a posture of awe. Again, scientists have been climbing and they're turning over summits, being met by scriptures that have been saying these things and theologians who've been saying these things for centuries. So that's my critique of the cult of self-worship. It deprives us of awe because God is infinitely more awe-inspiring than we are. Bottom line, we're just not as awesome as we like to think we are. All right? So, final thought here. I'm a big Abraham Kuyper fan. He famously said, most of you know, there's not a single square inch and all of created reality, over which Jesus, who is Lord over all, does not rightfully declare mine. So as we think about engaging culture, may we join Kuyper in affirming the supremacy of Jesus over every square inch of created reality. As our society is duped into worshiping me, myself, and I, let's join Paul when he says, from him and to him and through him are all things, to God be the glory forever. Amen? He is the Lord of science, the Lord of history, the Lord of philosophy, the Lord of art, and yes, the Lord of family and sex. We're at a critical moment in culture with the eyes of the world, in many ways, on us. Let's show, to borrow a Schaefferism, the watching world, the supreme, sovereign, gracious, triune, compassionate God of the Bible. May they see in us a satisfied worshipfulness in our lives that only makes sense if the supreme God of the Bible is real. May they see in us an unflinching fearlessness that only makes sense if God is sovereign and on the throne of the entire cosmos. May they see in us a willingness to die for them, even when we're assaulted and oppressed, that speaks to the reality of our gracious God who died for us when we were still his enemies. May we show them a relational authenticity in our communities, the kind of love where unity doesn't swallow up diversity and diversity doesn't swallow unity, the kind of love that only makes sense because we worship God in three persons. The Blessed Trinity exists. May we show them our weeping for shepherdless sheep, our tears for those who live as enemies of the cross of Christ, the kind of action-propelling compassion that reflects to them our God who grieves when his creatures settle for small, finite, created fixes rather than him, the all-satisfying Creator. We love our culture, the sexually broken in our culture, not by capitulating to the temptation to be liked and pretending that brokenness isn't brokenness, but by showing them the God who specializes in fixing our brokenness, and that we, just like them, are utterly broken apart from his grace. So make no mistake, as we engage culture, what we're up against is a theocracy of creation worship, a theocracy of self-worship that dates all the way back to the lying serpent in the garden, a theocracy that, like so many historic theocracies, seeks its heretics to marginalize and silence. And just like the church living under a false theocracy in the first century, we need the guts to say all over again in our century, Jesus, not Caesar, is Lord. Jesus, not self, is Lord. Amen? Thank you.